Hello, I'm Carla Hahn, Assistant Executive Director at the Association of Research Libraries. I'm responsible for ARL's program on transforming research library roles. Today's webcast is organized by the Association of Research Libraries, whose 123 members include many of the largest libraries in the U.S. and Canada. Thank you for joining us today as we explore how librarians connect with leaders in scholarly societies. The webcast is part of an effort at ARL to help members prepare for opportunities that may already exist or may develop in the near term. The research library community and scholarly societies work together in various ways, and building stronger relationships with scholarly societies is regularly identified as a priority activity for us at ARL. We know that disciplines have their own cultures, and each organization has its own history and structure, its own concerns and approaches to serving its members. One thing disciplines have in common, though, is that ultimately scholars and researchers manage their own societies. They are the key decision makers. So that means that libraries must find ways to work flexibly with society leaders to be an influence for positive change. ARL as an association can and does work with scholarly societies, but scholarly society leaders are much more commonly found at research institutions than in the offices of national organizations. Relationships with local researchers fostered by individual research libraries are often essential to successfully engaging scholarly societies. Libraries and societies tend to have shared concerns around advancing research and scholarship, as well as a shared interest in disseminating research to future scholars and the broader society. We know that research practices are evolving rapidly, and we're seeing new kinds of data and new approaches to disseminating research. And this demands new roles for libraries and also for scholarly societies. Engaging societies is a dynamic and somewhat opportunistic process, though, and there's a lot of ways that libraries can be helpful to societies and society leaders. So to help illustrate key issues and shared concerns, we recently added a group of talking points to the ARL website. It includes a list of some of the many ways libraries have been or could be a force for positive change. And I hope you'll take a look at them after the webcast if you haven't seen them already. But that's not what we're going to be reviewing here. Instead, what we'd like you to take away from today's presentations is an enriched understanding of what opportunities might be out there at your institutions. We want to increase the library community's readiness to reach out to society leaders. And we want librarians to be ready to respond promptly if you happen to encounter a researcher with a leadership role in a scholarly society. Finally, we hope to offer some inspiration to go looking for opportunities at your institution. So to those ends, we've arranged for you to hear two stories today, stories of successful interactions between librarians and society leaders. Our storytellers are scholar-librarian pairs who are going to speak from their own experiences. One story evolved around changing scholarly communication models, and one story evolved around the need to manage a discipline's research data in new ways. After you've heard from our two pairs, we're going to have time for audience questions. So keep that in mind as we're working through the presentations. You can submit questions at any point during the webcast using the button below the slides. We know that many of you are watching in groups, and we hope that everyone joining us today will find opportunities to discuss this topic with colleagues after the webcast. You're going to be hearing more from me later, but right now I want to turn the program over to my colleague, Julia Blixrud, who's going to introduce today's first story.
Thank you, Carla. Hello, everyone. I'm Assistant Executive Director, Scholarly Communication at ARL. Welcome to the webcast. As Carla explained, we think establishing relationships between society leaders and librarians will reap benefits for both. I hope the stories today will inspire librarians to seek opportunities to support those leaders as one means for producing and disseminating new knowledge changes. We at ARL have been interested in particular in new models for scholarly communication. This is one area in which librarians can work with scholarly leaders. Our new model publication study of last year identified a wide range of new kinds of works that scholars and researchers are using. In addition, our earlier report on research library publishing services highlighted how the library can contribute to the dissemination of scholarship. Providing technology and infrastructure may be one step, but developing the personal contacts is really the initial and more important step. So we begin with our first story from Indiana University. It comes from the world of New Models Publishing. Jennifer Laherty, the IU ScholarWorks librarian, and Jason Baird-Jackson, Associate Professor of Folklore and the editor of 2 scholarly journals, will be sharing their story with us. Jason edits Museum Anthropology, a journal published by the Council for Museum Anthropology, a section of the American Anthropological Association, and the open access journal, Museum Anthropology Review. And they will share with us how they became acquainted and have developed their own special working relationship.
Hello, everyone. This is Jennifer's voice. Thank you for joining me and Jason. We're going to have Jason get us started with some background from his involvement in scholarly communication issues as a faculty member, a journal editor, and a society member. He will go on to explain the various partnerships that have developed along his journey, and I'll fill in at the end with some library perspective. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone. This is Jason Jackson. It's a pleasure to be here with the group today, assembled online. I'm going to begin by, in a nutshell, kind of outlining the pathway that I took to the conversation we're having today. And then I'll go back and make some observations in a little bit more detail. First, I'd want to note the following, that I, up until July of this year, edited Museum Anthropology, the society journal that Julia mentioned. My editorship has just transferred to a new set of editors who've taken on work for that journal, but I'm continuing my work in partnership with the libraries here in publishing Museum Anthropology Review, which is an open access journal published as part of the IU ScholarWorks project. So part of my background derives out of work, though, as a journal editor for the American Anthropological Association, which is a large scholarly society with an active publishing program. But it also entails work that I've done here on our campus, both in the disciplines of anthropology and folklore related to scholarly communication issues. And then most recently, and I'll touch on this at the end of my remarks, I have been working in partnership with colleagues in the American Folklore Society to develop plans for an ongoing study and direction-setting initiative for the American Folklore Society related to scholarly communications. And that, too, may entail collaborations with the library here at Indiana, so I'll speak of that at the end. So let me begin then with a kind of nutshell. How did I get here? I came to the faculty at Indiana University in 2004, and when I joined the faculty, I was given a kind of special mandate in terms of the research areas that I would focus on. The goal was to, the search that led to my being hired here, was to bring in someone who would focus in particular on the intersections between folklore and ethnomusicology study and questions that have been rising over the last decade related to intellectual and cultural property issues. I came to that domain as a person who'd worked in museums on tangible cultural property issues. But when I got here, my charge was to expand into neighboring areas such as copyright and intellectual property and new technologies and the impact that those were having, particularly on communities around the world vis-a-vis their vernacular cultures and traditions, which is the focus and concern of my field of folklore studies. So in that context, I began my career here on the faculty teaching some courses that related to these issues. And in the course of that teaching work with graduate students, we touched upon some of the changes that were unfolding in scholarly communications. And so part of my interest in these matters arises out of a kind of research focus in my own scholarship. At the same time that beginning was unfolding, the Indiana University Library was taking up a whole series of new initiatives, which we now know locally as IU ScholarWorks, and I became involved at the departmental level in that. I went on to take up the editorship of this AAA journal, the American Anthropological Association journal, Museum Anthropology. I'll speak in a moment about some of the things that I learned in the context of the really radical changes that the American Anthropological Association experienced as a scholarly society vis-a-vis its communications work. That led, in turn, to the kinds of projects that I've been doing with the librarians here at IU. And then most recently, that led to the establishment of Museum Anthropology Review, which I'm editing now, and also to the work that I've begun doing in partnership with the American Folklore Society. So there's a kind of trajectory from local interest and research interest to involvement in various aspects of scholarly society, engagement with scholarly communication. The transition point I would want to make, though, is that having been an editor of an American Anthropological Association journal doesn't empower me to represent the association in these questions. I have some experiences which have shaped my own work, but I'm not a spokesperson for the AAA. And similarly, although I'm now chairing a communications and folklore working group for the American Folklore Society, I'm just one voice in a conversation that's unfolding within the AFS on these issues. I bring to that conversation, though, the experiences that I'll talk a bit about now. Okay, so let me begin in more depth, just to sketch the connections between the work that I've been doing and the librarians that I'm so fortunate to partner with here at Indiana. The first connection came in the context of the establishment of an IU institutional repository. Like many institutions, the IU libraries have set up a DSpace-driven institutional repository, and for a time that was just known as IU ScholarWorks. That was our local brand for our DSpace repository. Now, with the divergence of the IU ScholarWorks program into a number of domains, and Jen can speak of this more in a few moments, we think of that repository as IU ScholarWorks repository, and it's a kind of parallel project to our Open Journal Systems-based journal publishing system. And that's the system that the journal that I now edit, Museum Anthropology Review, is published with under the banner IU ScholarWorks Journals. So several years ago, the librarians here were beginning the work of setting up the repository, and my department got very interested in being an early adopter for IU ScholarWorks repository. That led to some very local partnerships during which I learned a tremendous amount about the work that's been going on, not only in the library here, but elsewhere. And it was one of my first introductions to the library side of the scholarly communications world and the way that that's changing. Then the next phase of the story relates to my work editing museum anthropology for the AAA. That editorship was very exciting intellectually, but it unfolded during a particularly challenging time for the AAA. When I began the work, the journal was co-published by the Society or the Association and the University of California Press, and that partnership was celebrated in the world of scholarly communications because it was a major publisher partnering with a large university press, and there was a lot of excitement connected to that, in particular because this was at the same time that the association was developing and launching its AnthroSource initiative, which was to be a disciplinary portal organized by the AAA that would, amongst other things, make its journals fully available electronically. But there was also a goal that the AnthroSource project would include a number of other dimensions, including things that we now would recognize as a disciplinary repository. Some of those functions were set aside and some were postponed or eliminated from the project, but we may see them come to pass eventually. In any case, the financial side was the big story during those years, from 2005 to 2008, basically. And the story there was that the arrangement that had been established between the association and the press, while it got the job done very well, it wasn't financially sustainable in the way that it had been set up. It was a fee-for-service arrangement in which California was paid to do the various tasks that it was charged to do. They did that well, but this all was predicated on income, which didn't fully materialize, so that as a scholarly society, the AAA was pinched financially, and it faced a lot of serious governance questions as a result of that. And this relates to the broader question, which I think is at issue in the debate or the discussion that we're beginning, which has to do with the sustainability of scholarly societies in a context in which many of them are their key revenue source are their publications programs. All of this led eventually to the move from UC Press to Wiley Blackwell, who's the publishing partner with the AAA today, in an arrangement which is set up very differently than the California one, in which Wiley Blackwell and the AAA are profit sharing on the publications program. And from a governance and financial point of view, I think the AAA is very pleased with the state of that arrangement. For me as a scholar, though, it has raised a number of questions which have led to my further involvement in open access projects and in scholarly communication more generally. The key piece that I would mention here, though, is that during the midst of this period of uncertainty when California was still the publisher for the AAA, it looked very likely, at least at a kind of rank and file level, that many of the journals, which were themselves not money makers in and of themselves within the publishing portfolio, were faced with real trouble. So the American Anthropological Association has a number of journals. Many of them are smaller journals like Museum Anthropology, and the cost of publishing those journals at a kind of individual journal level was greatly outstripping the revenues that they were producing. So I was charged by the section of the AAA, the Council on Museum Anthropology, which publishes museum anthropology, to figure out what would happen if the journal had to cease publication as it had been published. And there were a number of options that were being considered, but one of them was to establish an open access journal that would in essence eventually take the place of museum anthropology should museum anthropology have to cease publication for any one of a number of reasons, which seemed quite possible at the moment in the run-up to what became the Blackwell decision, but none of us knew that that was going to happen. So that was where the founding of Museum Anthropology Review came in, and so that journal was established during my editorship of Museum Anthropology as a kind of fork in the publishing program that I was involved in. For a time, the two journals, I edited both of them, and they both seemed to thrive editorially, and with the Blackwell deal coming into being, the financial pressure on Museum Anthropology was set aside, at least for the time being, and thus Museum Anthropology was not under threat of disappearance, but Museum Anthropology had begun succeeding on its own. And so with the blessing of the leadership of the Council on Museum Anthropology, I have continued to edit that journal, which is a publication not of the Council or of the AAA, but now of the IU libraries. There was one last piece probably to mention because it relates to the questions we're considering today, and that is that when Museum Anthropology Review was begun, it was begun in a very informal kind of way. Its first incarnation was in a system based on the blogging software WordPress, which was very easy to use, and it got the journal up and running very quickly. Many of our authors were eager to support this new venture, but one of the questions that arose was the permanence and availability of the content that we were publishing primarily on this WordPress platform, and that was where I partnered with the libraries and the IU ScholarWorks initiative to make that material more durable and more findable in our repository program, so that the first years of Museum Anthropology Review's publication, we were in essence making that content available in PDF form in our DSpace archive. That relationship in turn led with the growth of that journal project into the move to using open journal systems, which is how we publish the journal today, and we do that with the support of everyone here at the library. And it's been a great learning experience for me, negotiating all of these changes along the way. The final thing that I'll speak of then is my work with the American Folklore Society. The American Folklore Society is aware, like all scholarly societies, that there are a number of changes that are unfolding, that it behooves the society to grapple with what's happening in the present and to lay a foundation for plans for the future. The American Folklore Society is on that task, and I was honored to be asked to chair its working group on communications and folklore. So we've assembled a group of colleagues across the discipline to begin the work of mapping the current state of communications in the field, but also to think about the needs that scholars are identifying, and then looking for partners and allies to proceed towards developing new kinds of projects that meet new needs in the current environment. And we're at the earliest stages now of speaking between the American Folklore Society and the librarian staff here at IU about possible partnerships. One motivating factor at a local level here then is the strength of the library holdings at IU as they relate to the field of folklore studies. Part of this stems from the fact that we have a long and well-established specialty library here at IU dedicated to works in the field of folklore, and those collections are now presently being digitized as part of a Google Books project here at IU, and are destined to be included in HathiTrust, which will make them available not only they'll be available not only via Google Books, but also the underlying files will be available for us to build new projects with that content. And so the hope is that as the leading society for folklore in the United States, and one that's large in the company of world organizations, that the AFS, in partnership with the library here that has large and significant holdings and a strong disciplinary presence on campus, can build resources which will be good for the field and for the scholarly and general public communities as well. So those are some of the things we've been involved in. I'm going to hand the phone back to Jen, and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jason. That was a great overview. And I will just stress a few points from the library perspective. So it's very unlikely that we would be this far along with Jason and his good work that he's trying to accomplish if it weren't for the folklore and anthropology librarian Moira Smith's crucial involvement with her departments and societies. So as well as the engagement of other subject specialists like her who speak out on issues that are important to both research libraries and societies. So the way this all started from the library angle is that several years ago, our scholarly communication librarian heard about the activity in the AAA at a library conference, so librarians speaking to librarians. She came home and she asked Moira, the subject specialist, about this, who said, hey, this is big stuff. You need to go talk with Jason. And her response was, well, who's Jason? And so the rest of the story is just what you just heard. So that partnership began many years ago, and it's been great ever since. Jason has really helped us push our limits as to what we can do for the faculty. So the real value the library adds to these conversations and collaborations lies in the involvement of our subject librarians that they have with the faculty in their departments, as well as within their respective disciplinary societies. The faculty expect us, the librarians, to know things like what are the economic and publishing trends in their disciplines. So we think that the deep knowledge of the disciplinary environment that our subject librarians have, coupled with the knowledge that our scholarly communications staff has regarding things like copyright, author rights, new publishing models, and the technology that can deliver things, makes our crew of staff a very valuable and informed set of colleagues to have in these conversations, and our faculty know that we have this expertise. My last point can be best summarized by a call to action item that was actually raised from an ARL report. The report was the research library's role in digital repository services. And in this report, the call to action item is this, that research libraries should, quote, base service development strategies on substantive assessment of local needs rather than blindly replicating work done at another institution, end quote. So the value proposition of us working with the American Folklore Society is obvious to us given IU's all-around strength in the discipline. And so we're certainly excited to be having these early-stage conversations and look forward to being a partner in producing services and great content that will benefit many. Thank you very much. That's all from IU for now.
Thank you, Jennifer and Jason, for a wonderful story. I'm sure you've gotten our listeners reflecting on their own faculty encounters. Unquote. Scholarly societies are among the many stakeholders addressed in the report, actually as are research libraries. But increasingly, scholarly societies are recognizing that they have important roles to play in building new shared infrastructure for research fields in their disciplines. Libraries, too, have capabilities they can bring to bear on issues around creating ongoing access to community data resources. We're going to hear a story now about the development of one such community resource and how library staff and a scholarly society leader created a new kind of partnership. Our storytellers this time are Sayeed Choudhury and Robert Hanisch. Both are at the Johns Hopkins University. And some of you may have heard them speak before about the Virtual Observatory project. But today we've asked them to tell us the story of how the relationships that resulted in that project got started. I'll turn it over to Bob and Sayeed.
Thanks, Carla. This is Sayeed Choudhury speaking. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I should point out one clarification. Bob is actually at the Space Telescope Science Institute, which is located on our campus, but it's a different organization. I really enjoyed hearing the presentation from our colleagues at IU, and one of the things that I'm taking away from that in terms of common themes really are specific needs and very much the personal relationships that are important. And that's certainly true in our case. As Carla mentioned, we've been working for some time with our astronomers looking at data curation in terms of how do we start to harvest, gather, preserve the large amounts of data that's being produced by the astronomy community, bring them into library archive environments in a way that they can be used and reused, not only within astronomy, but perhaps across other disciplines. So our work really began with that focus in mind as we started to learn more about how astronomers produce their data, where those data might be residing or not in safe places, and what people might want to do with them. So the Virtual Observatory was an excellent framework for talking about those discussions. Then it became very clear that there was a very specific need in terms of how we might actually get to those data sets. It was our understanding from speaking with Bob and others that astronomers had attempted to gather these data sets in a direct way by asking for them, and that wasn't terribly successful. What we concluded was that we needed to embed the data acquisition aspects into the publishing workflow. The idea being that when an astronomer or a group of astronomers is publishing a paper, it's the best time, quite frankly, to ask them where their data might be, to actually get a hold of the data sets themselves, perhaps ask them to put metadata attached to those data, and so on. We spent a good deal of time from the library perspective putting together what we thought might be an ideal workflow for how something like this might work. We did work with Bob and some of the other astronomers in our local environment to vet that idea and to flesh it out. But fairly quickly, it became very evident to us that this was being done in an abstract way. It didn't really matter at the end of the day if the publishers themselves were not interested in working with this kind of workflow or modifying their systems to accommodate that type of workflow. In essence, what we had to do was identify a couple of journals, talk about who's actually publishing those journals and what's the right organizational context for engaging these publishing partners. It was in that spirit that we contacted the American Astronomical Society, which of course has overview of two of the well-known North American journals. And they were the ones that could, of course, communicate with the publisher in a much more systematic way than we could. So one of the important lessons that I think we learned in our case is if the library had gone directly to the scholarly publisher in this case, it would not have been as effective a direct communication channel. It was important to have the scholars in the form of their scholarly society in the room and basically saying that we believe this is important. We've already talked to the library about how this might work. So they're not just coming to you out of the blue. It's not without any context, and it's not in a vacuum. It's very much something that's already been vetted with us. Understandably, the publisher for AAS has to respond to the American Astronomical Society's request, not to the library at Johns Hopkins. So by having that intermediary, if you will, of the scholars coming to the society, that was a critical aspect of how we were able to engage the American Astronomical, the publishers of the American Astronomical Society. Having said that, we had to make the case to them directly. In one case, we basically went to the previous publisher and pointed out this is how we would imagine going about doing something like this. while some of the executive leadership from the AAS and some of the astronomers who were the executive leadership were in the room. And we had to convince the publisher that this was a good idea, this was a tractable problem, it was a manageable problem, and having the astronomers in the room, again, was tremendously helpful in terms of making that case. Now, one thing that I think Bob can speak to much more than I can is in the first case, when we dealt with the prior publisher for AAS, there wasn't the level of engagement that I think we needed to follow this through. In that case, the AAS actually made a decision, and there certainly may have been other factors involved, to change the publisher. And the current publisher that we're dealing with right now is aware of this particular data curation requirement and is very committed to actually seeing this through. So as you can imagine, making a decision like changing the publisher for a scholarly society is clearly not something the library can do, but we can certainly talk about what the requirements were or are, and then say to the new publisher, this is how we think the system might have to work. It's been very critical in this sense that the AAS is really the organizational framework for mediating, quite frankly, a lot of these conversations. There is a potential, I will say, that the library may have a certain view because we're thinking about long-term preservation, we're thinking about harvesting data, whereas the publisher may not be thinking about those as deeply in some cases as we are. So it's critical that the scholarly society, in fact, be the one that sits in the room and basically say, well, these are our needs, these are important to us. It's only the library or it's only the publisher that's actually providing the function, but we're the ones defining the needs, and we as the library have to respond to those needs. I think that at the end of the day, though, a lot of this does come down to personal relationships. So the fact that we had very good working relationships, not only with Bob, but a couple of other astronomers, some of whom have moved on from Hopkins, who were on the editorial board for these publications, that was really important. And at the end of the day, just like we heard from IU, it does come down to the fact that there's trust between the individuals that are trying to work on something like this together. And then that trust gets conveyed into the organizational conversations that take place. And I think that's a critical element of that. And I think without trying to put any pressure on Bob, with that theme of trust, I will turn it over to him to describe some of the perspective from the researcher and society perspective.
No pressure at all, Sayeed. This is Bob Hanisch. I just want to say at the outset here, I'm calling into this conversation from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where I'm attending the Triennial General Assembly of the International Astronomical Union. And one of the reasons I am attending this meeting is because I co-chair an IAU working group on libraries and on the collaboration between the research community and the library community in astronomy. And I would say, as just a word of background about this collaborative issue, is that the AAS has long recognized the needs of the library community and engaged them in its planning, its strategic planning for its journal publications and its overall activities. I was the past chair of the American Astronomical Society Publication Board, and that board always has a representative from the library community as part of the constituency. The AAS, as a scholarly society, has also been a leader in terms of electronic publishing and electronic sharing of data. And in particular, the AAS journals were probably one of the first to begin to systematically handle tabular data in digital form already more than 10 years ago, and have gotten into managing of other more complicated digital data sets such as imaging and spectral data. But then we started to encounter issues about size of data sets and long-term management and curation of these data sets, and that's where the long collaboration with the library community naturally came to the foreground again. Is there a common solution for managing these more complex data objects that could build upon the curation and long-term commitment to management of information that exists in the library community? And that's how the current collaboration in terms of managing digital data for the AAS journals has come to the fore, and also how a more extensive collaboration that Sayeed and I are members of toward digital data curation more generally is moving ahead. In particular, one colleague whose name bears mentioning is Alex Saleh in the Physics and Astronomy Department at Johns Hopkins. He's been instrumental in development of the databases for the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, which is probably the most widely used digital data collection in astronomy at this time. And Alex, being at JHU, was sort of the catalyst that brought Sayeed and myself together to more systematically approach this issue of digital data management in astronomy. I think I'll stop there, Sayeed.
Thanks, Bob. I think one other person we should mention is Ethan Vishniak, who used to be at Hopkins and has moved on to McMaster. And I think Ethan is, in fact, the one who can speak on the editorial board for the journal. And I can tell you that one of the things that we've found over time is as we start to interact with the publisher for AAS, there are occasions, of course, where we may say we'd really like this kind of information, or what would happen if we proposed to change your workflow in this way. It's been really critical for us to have the support of Ethan as that person who's again sitting in the middle, basically saying, this is why this is important for us as astronomers when he talks to the publisher. And I went on the other side, to be completely fair and objective, he can sometimes say to us, you may do that from the perspective of the preservation need, but that's going to add 10 minutes to the submission time for an article, and that may not seem like a lot to you, but for us, that is a lot of time. And when I go to the authors and tell them that you have to do these steps, there'll be some pushback. So getting that kind of feedback has been really important across the spectrum as well. So with that, I think what I'd like to do is turn it back over to our colleagues at ARL, and we can move into the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sayeed and Bob. You've given us a wonderful glimpse into the way that you have begun working together and continue to work together on your project. This is Julia, and I'm now going to turn it over to our listeners and ask whether you have any questions. We're delighted to take those questions on behalf of our speakers and feed them to them. If you would like to direct the question to a particular person, please do so using the appropriate box that you have down below. So first thing is I can start with a question. Perhaps I will direct this first to Jason, because he's had a number of disciplines or different cultures that he's been working with. Do you think there was a specific aspect of the disciplinary cultures in your project that created that opportunity for libraries? Were there specific elements of that culture that were particularly supportive for you to work with the library community?
I think that this is Jason again. I think that there are cultural differences across disciplines, and they surely are a factor in terms of how local relationships play out, and also how organizational partnerships might grow up between libraries and scholarly societies as societies. And remember, in this case, both scholarly societies have professional staffs as well as executive boards who guide the governance of these organizations. The point that I would point to, though, as a conditioning one, is a question of scale. It's simply more difficult to achieve various kinds of projects in an organization as large as the American Anthropological Association relative to a large but not humongously large organization like the American Folklore Society. In the case of the American Folklore Society, we have a professional staff of about 2 people, whereas in the case of the American Anthropological Association, it's several orders of magnitude larger. In the case of the AAA, there were a number of very well-positioned and very knowledgeable people involved in developing the initial vision for Anthrosource. On the planning committee for that project were a number of subject area librarians from around the country, and there were also folks who were really leaders in scholarly communications issues, but then implementing some of their vision for that project in practice was a challenge, not only for financial reasons, but just governance reasons. The organization is just very large with a pretty complicated organizational structure. And I think that is going to be true in any kind of scholarly society partnerships. And just on the ground, at a ground level, I think that this means that medium-sized scholarly societies that are large enough to have resources and brain power but not so large as to be difficult to steer may play a really valuable role in charting the kinds of things that are going to happen in the next period. I'll stop there.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Those are wonderful observations. I wonder, Bob, if you had anything to add from your perspective.
Well, I think there's just been, as I alluded to earlier, this natural partnership between the research community and the library community in astronomy. Originally, it stemmed primarily from issues such as the cost of journals, and the librarians wanted to be involved in the society's decisions, their business decisions about how to price journals so that the libraries could retain maximum access. But in the past several years, I think the focal point for that collaboration and joint interest has changed. Not that this issue has disappeared, but astronomy libraries, like research libraries generally, are in this act of reinventing themselves as their focus changes from a repository of books and journals in paper form to a repository of information, which is increasingly in digital form. And the librarians that I work with in astronomy are keenly interested in how they can maximize the utility of their collections, maximize their added value as managers of these increasingly digital resources, and continue to play a role which is of an agent for data discovery, information discovery, to assist the research astronomer in doing their job in the most effective way possible. This was, in fact, the crux of the discussions that we had just a few days ago here in Rio de Janeiro, and that formed the ongoing basis for the strong interest in collaboration and exchange of information between the research astronomers and the librarians that serve our community so competently.
That's great, Bob, because that leads me into my next question, which is one of, for the librarians, about the flexibility of the libraries in terms of working with the different society leaders. And I wonder, Sayeed, if you wanted to comment about areas of which you feel that you needed to be flexible or your ideas had to change as you began to work with Bob.
I think what's really critical in terms of flexibility is we really are, at some level, talking about different cultures coming together. And the library has a certain view of data preservation, and that's different from the view that the astronomers might have, and that's different from the view that the publishers serving the astronomers might have as well. When we sit at a whiteboard and think about how to build a system, we have that particular cultural perspective in mind. And there's nothing explicit about not trying to accommodate others, but when we get into the room with the astronomers or the scholars themselves and then the publishers, of course what tends to happen is as they bring their perspective into the mix, we start to look at that wonderful pristine view we have and go, oh, right, that's correct. We hadn't thought about that, or yes, you're right, that might be 10 minutes more. We didn't realize that was such a big issue. Or the publisher might say that's going to require a major software development effort on our part, given the way our system works. I think that's where the flexibility really has to come into the picture. We have to understand that as we move from our internal view of how something might be done to the more shared view of how something can be accomplished, it requires some adjustment on our part. One of the really best ways, if you will, to try and accommodate some of that is to appeal to what are open standards, so to speak. It's one thing for me to say to a publishing partner that, you know, you have to do it this way because Hopkins thinks this is the way it should be done. It's quite another for me to say that, well, if you were to do this, it's a sufficiently flexible enough standard that it will support some of the other publications you're dealing with. It's a much more powerful argument in terms of the way in which we may need to be flexible.
Great, thanks. Jennifer, since you've been working with different societies, what are your ideas about how the library needs to be flexible or has been flexible?
Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer. Thank you, Julia. I would certainly like to say that everything Sayeed said was great, and I'll just add that I tend to be way too flexible, just to be quite frank about that. I like to offer the moon and think it's all possible right from the get-go, and what I've learned in my support for endeavors that we work with the faculty is to sort of be more upfront about what do each side want to accomplish, what kind of startup information would be useful to have even before the conversations get going. Like, what would be your business plan? What's the scope of the project? What would you like to accomplish? And for both parties to put that on the table so that you have something to think about ahead of time. I find that that's starting to become a regular part of my conversations with faculty, even at the very beginning. So in some ways, you can be too flexible, and bringing it down to sort of the earth and what is possible is a good place to start, too.
Great, thank you. My next question for all of you to think about for a second is about maybe being surprised in terms of working with the other party. Why don't I start with Sayeed? Is there anything that surprised you about working with Bob?
Well, not Bob in particular, but in terms of the overall experience, I think I'm going to resonate with what Jennifer just said, that the business-like aspect of this was, quite frankly, a bit of a surprise. I'm just speaking completely honestly that when I think of scholars, in particular astronomers, I have this image of people staring at the night sky and pondering the deep questions of the universe, and then you walk into a room and the executive leadership of the Scholarly Society is asking some very difficult business questions, which they have to do. And Jason mentioned the word sustainability or the topic of sustainability of scholarly societies. That was a huge discussion, a huge topic in our discussions. And while, of course, libraries are very much moving into that kind of mind frame and that sort of view of things, I was a little bit surprised at how front and center those kinds of concerns and topics were, and I think she's absolutely right that it helps constrain the desire we all have to be very flexible.
Bob, what do you think? What was your surprise about working with Sayeed in the library?
Well, I guess I would characterize it as less of a surprise and more of an appreciation for things I just didn't know about how a major university research library functioned. I found it very reassuring to know that the Hopkins Library had begun thinking about these issues of data preservation and the movement into digital very early on. I'm not sure how widespread that movement was in the research library community, but certainly Hopkins was the leader or one of the leaders in this area. And so what I found in interacting with Sayeed and his colleagues was just a very high level of experience, competence, recognition of the problems that were associated with preservation and curation of digital data. We spoke the same language, basically. We both knew what metadata was, appreciated the term, how difficult it is to collect quality metadata, maintain it through changes and versions of documents. We both realized the complexities of mapping the relationships amongst the various components of scholarly publications between the text and the figures and the associated underlying data. And so there was just great commonality there, which I did not really anticipate would be there from the beginning, but which has made the collaboration, once we got down to talking about astronomy data in particular, just that much more fruitful and energizing.
Jason and Jennifer, did you want to offer your perspectives on, in terms of how you were working with each other on this, either, surprises, appreciation?
Well, I'll start. This is Jennifer. I would just add that what surprised me about working with Jason is just how far charisma can get you with respect to what you would like to have a partner work with you on. So Jason has truly pushed the endeavors of this library into a great new place, and we're grateful to him for that. And he's flexible, he's wonderful to work with, he knows the environment in which the libraries are living, and he brings this perspective of the scholar, the editor, the society member, and really invigorates us to think very deeply about how the library can help solve some pretty big issues. So that's what I'll add.
That was very kind, Jennifer. I wanted to just add one point to this question, then circle back to an earlier question where there was a point that I should have made that I failed to. That in terms of surprises, the thing that surprised me most, and I think this was just great fortune on my part and perfect timing in general, and that was that my engagements with our library here came at a time in which this library, on its faculty and staff at the highest levels, all the way up to the library director, had made a strong commitment to doing work in this area so that, as they say, timing is everything. And just how ready this library was always affirming and given the way that universities sometimes are, sometimes a bit surprising. So I've been very grateful on that front. The question was raised earlier about disciplinary cultures. There's one coda that I would add to that discussion, and that is that many scholarly societies are composed of constituent units, sometimes called affiliated organizations or sections or something of that sort. And I think that's a place where internal cultural difference plays a really crucial role. To illustrate this, just let me remind us that the journal that I edited for the AAA was published by the Museum Anthropology section, and that meant that was a constellation of particularly museum-oriented anthropologists, and they brought with them their own professional background to these discussions. One example of this that's relevant generally to scholarly communications is that museum scholars work outside of university contexts, and they also work in a context which is much more open to engagement with broad publics. And that has meant that museum anthropologists immediately have a stronger predisposition, for instance, to having open access-related conversations. In a similar sort of way, the American Folklore Society is composed of a very large number of scholars in public practice who work in things like arts agencies and archives and arts councils and public folklore programs of various kinds. And that conditions their engagement with scholarly communications issues. One place you can see this is both the museum anthropologists and the folklorists in their recommendations as scholarly societies on questions of tenure are much more open to a diversity of media for scholarly communications than is typical of the average academic discipline, so that the American Folklore Society and the Cultural Museum Anthropology, even in a pre-digital era, had written strongly worded documents supporting the creation of, let's say, museum exhibits in a tenure and promotion context. That carries over into the digital environment that we're living in now. These subunits or smaller disciplines both have strong commitments to the kinds of issues that are now facing everyone in a public humanities context, at least.
Thanks, Jason. We just got a question, and it actually sort of follows on to your comment. The question is that some editors on my campus are struggling with transitioning their journals to an open access model, some of those being already society journals, or some of those are society journals. They want to know about business models and would need advice on how to approach this in phases. Do you folks have advice on it? And I guess I'll start with you, Jason, since you had talked about it in your context.
It's one variety of the question. From a journal's point of view, some kinds of journals are just going to be easier to convert than others. And colleagues and I have written about this in a number of contexts, but a journal that is a house journal under the authority of, let's say, an academic department is just going to be easier to move than a scholarly society journal, but a scholarly society journal is going to be easier to move than one that's fully controlled by a large commercial publisher. And none of us have the complete set of answers as to how to build sustainable business models for not-for-profit open access journals. And on the scholarly society side of the equation, it's the big question, which is, and this is reflected not only in conversations that are going on elsewhere, but in the ARL documents that were prepared for today, that the big question is, how is it that scholarly societies will find pathways to diversify their revenue streams in the context of potentially diversifying the services they offer to members so as to be able to support journal publishing without relying more broadly so much on journal publishing itself as the income-producing activity for the society. And none of us have complete ideas about that. But the good news at a local level in terms of a particular journal and a move from total access to open access as publishing is that while it is not without cost, the costs involved in publishing are dramatically lessened, not completely eliminated through the move. And in some ways, the Museum Anthropology vis-a-vis Museum Anthropology Review has been a kind of real-world experiment in setting as many variables as possible, keeping them constant between the two journals. They, for a time, had the same editor. They published in the same area. They had the same author and peer review base. And we asked the question, in essence, what would be the difference in terms of outreach and effectiveness on the one hand for these two journals and costs on the other? And the orders of magnitude and difference of cost are astronomically different between the framework that Museum Anthropology was published under with California and the framework that Museum Anthropology Review is published under with the IU libraries. It's not that there are no costs, but the costs are greatly reduced. And during this period in which we're kind of finding our way still with Museum Anthropology Review, the library has been a great partner in helping us deal with the relatively small costs that do exist. And they mainly have to do with getting the system configured in which the publishing gets done, setting up OJS, for instance, in our case.
Great, thank you. I'd like to turn one last question that we have to Sayeed, perhaps, to begin, and that is that we've been talking today with just the two of you, two pairs, about new forms of scholarly communication and library and society collaboration and so on. But what are your sense of the entire academy moving in this direction? Are we seeing just a few of these kinds of examples here and there, or are there lots more conversations taking place on campuses in your own experience?
My sense is that these conversations are taking place really throughout the community. I'm not as familiar with these efforts as I might be, but I know that certain libraries are moving very aggressively, if you will, into becoming publishing entities themselves. Michigan has announced a publishing service out of the libraries. I believe Penn State may have one too. I think that really what I would urge everyone, I suppose, myself included, in the community to do is to have these kinds of conversations across the spectrum of partners, the libraries, the publishers, and the societies. It really does vary across disciplines. It varies across the type of content, as we just heard. Even the entity that's responsible for a publication has an influence. So it's very important, I think, to understand the delineation of roles. There is an almost seductive tendency to think, well, how difficult could this be? I can really take it all on, whether I'm a publisher or a library or a scholarly society. And I think it's just a very useful exercise to speak with the relevant players and find out where each of them has comparative advantage or comparative strengths and try and form some sort of collaboration around that.
Great, thank you. We did note a report, or I have noted a report just recently published by Ithaca on sustaining digital resources and on-the-ground view of projects today, which also addresses some of the different roles that parts of the organization play in terms of supporting these kinds of new efforts. And our readers probably, if you go under Ithaca and look for sustaining digital resources, you'll be able to find that. And we could provide a link to that on our website, which reminds me to tell you all that the archive for this webcast will be available shortly after after the event is over. And to say that we're coming up to the top of the hour, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And we hope this has given you some ideas for how you might prepare yourself for those chance or even perhaps planned encounters with scholarly society leaders. Our stories were illustrative, intended to provide different perspectives relating to different types of activities. But the outcome, I think, has been the same, the building and strengthening of a relationship between a society leader and a librarian. I'd especially like to thank Jennifer and Jason and Sayeed and Bob for taking what I know is valuable time to tell their stories to us. For those who are not part of a group that are listening to this broadcast, I know that there are some of you who are sitting in as a group watching the webcast. We hope that you will take the time to review the study guide that we prepared for it. Other resources are available, as Carla had mentioned, on the webcast, on the website for the webcast. And we would encourage you to tell us your stories. We'd love to collect stories about these kinds of interactions. And our email addresses were on the screen, and we'd like to thank you again very much for joining us this afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you. This does conclude today's conference. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time and have a great day.